The air in the quaint town of Hollyridge carried the unmistakable scent of pine and gingerbread as Nicholas Claus strolled down Main Street. Twinkling lights adorned every storefront, and the sound of carolers singing Silent Night warmed the hearts of passers-by. Nicholas, a tall man with kind eyes and a snow-white beard, greeted every child and adult with a hearty laugh and a twinkle that seemed almost magical. The townsfolk affectionately called him Santa, not just because of his festive job during the holiday season, but because he embodied the spirit of Christmas year-round. Nicholas had always chosen to live humbly, shunning the extravagant lifestyle his wealth afforded him. Though he could easily afford a mansion on the hill, he opted for a cozy cottage on the edge of town, surrounded by a grove of evergreens. To him, true wealth was in the joy he could bring to others. But this Christmas felt different. His heart was full, not with holiday cheer, but with love for Mary Langley, the woman who had stolen his heart. Mary was a schoolteacher with a gentle demeanor and an infectious laugh. She had moved to Hollyridge just a year ago, bringing with her a passion for helping children and a knack for baking pies that won every town contest. Nicholas fell for her during one of her community fundraisers, charmed by her kindness and simplicity. Their love blossomed over late-night walks under the stars and quiet evenings by the fire. By Thanksgiving, he had proposed, presenting her with a modest ring that reflected their shared value for simplicity over extravagance. She had said yes with tears in her eyes. But as Christmas approached, Nicholas found himself restless. Doubt crept into his thoughts, whispering questions he couldn't ignore. Mary had grown up in modest circumstances, and her life with him promised comfort and security. But what if those were the reasons she loved him? What if his wealth was the foundation of their relationship? He couldn't shake the nagging fear. If I lost everything tomorrow, would she still love me for who I am? Nicholas sat by the fire one evening, stroking the head of his loyal Bernese mountain dog, Jingle. The flames crackled softly, casting shadows that danced across the walls of his cozy home. I've spent my whole life giving to others, he murmured to himself. But this is about knowing if what I've received in return is real. As the snow fell gently outside, Nicholas resolved to uncover the truth about Mary's love, no matter how painful the journey might be. The decision weighed on Nicholas heavily, like the thick snowfall that blanketed Hollyridge in December. Days passed, but his resolve grew stronger. He had always been a man of conviction, and he told himself this was no different. If Mary's love wasn't genuine, it was better to know now, before they built a life on a shaky foundation. Nicholas sought the counsel of his oldest friend and confidant, Eli. Eli had worked alongside Nicholas for decades, managing the logistics of his various ventures while also serving as a sounding board for his more unconventional ideas. He was wiry and sharp, with a wit that often clashed with Nicholas's earnestness. Still, their friendship was as enduring as the ancient oak tree in Nicholas's backyard. One evening, as snow piled high against the windows of Nicholas's cottage, Eli arrived, brushing the frost from his overcoat. He stomped his boots on the mat and sniffed the air. "Gingerbread?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Left over for Mary," Nicholas said with a faint smile. He gestured to the armchair by the fire, where a steaming mug of mulled cider awaited. Eli settled in, crossing his legs and shooting Nicholas a curious glance. "All right, Nick, what's the big idea? You sounded like you had the weight of the world on your shoulders when you called me over." Nicholas didn't speak at first. He stared into the fire, his expression distant. Finally, he turned to Eli. "I'm going to tell Mary I've lost everything," he said quietly. Eli's mouth fell open, but he quickly recovered, setting his mug down on the side table with a clink. "You're going to what?" "I'm going to tell her I'm broke," Nicholas repeated, his voice steady. "That all my savings are gone, my investments failed, and my properties were sold to cover debts. I want to see how she reacts." Eli leaned forward, his sharp, gray eyes narrowing. "Nick, are you out of your mind? What kind of lunacy is this? Mary loves you, but does she love me for who I am, or for what I can provide?" Nicholas countered, his tone firm. "I have to know, Eli. I can't marry her with this doubt hanging over my head." Eli shook his head, exhaling deeply. Nick, listen to me. Love doesn't need to be tested like this. You've been with Mary long enough to see her heart. Why would you risk everything to prove something that's already clear? Nicholas ran a hand through his white hair, his brow furrowed. It's not clear to me, Eli. Not completely. I've seen too many relationships fall apart when the money dries up. People change when the future they envision crumbles. If Mary can't stand by me in the worst of times, then she's not the person I thought she was. Eli frowned, his fingers drumming on the armrest. And what if you're wrong? What if you push her away with this charade? You're playing a dangerous game, Nick. Love isn't a business deal where you test the margins. It's trust, faith. Nicholas looked back at him, his expression pained but resolute. I'd rather face heartbreak now than live a lie for the rest of my life. If she truly loves me, this won't change anything. And if she doesn't, I need know. The room fell silent, the only sound the crackling fire and the faint howling of the wind outside. Eli rubbed his temples and muttered under his breath before finally speaking. Fine, but don't expect me to clean up the mess when this all blows up in your face. Nicholas allowed himself a small smile. You've been cleaning up my messes for years, old friend. What's one more? Eli snorted but didn't argue further. So, what's the plan? How are you going to stage this disaster? Nicholas explained his idea in detail, outlining how he would subtly build the illusion of financial ruin. It wasn't just a simple lie. It had to be believable. He would plant the story of a business failure, sell off one of his less conspicuous assets, and even speak to a few townsfolk to corroborate the tale if Mary asked around. Eli's skepticism was evident, but he begrudgingly nodded as Nicholas laid out the steps. You've thought this through, Eli admitted, though his tone was laced with disapproval. I have to, Nicholas said. This is my future we're talking about. My heart. As the fire burned low, the two men sat in silence, the weight of the plan settling over them like the snow outside. Nicholas felt a pang of guilt, but he pushed it aside. He told himself it was necessary. Come what may, he would find the truth. The clock on the mantel chimed midnight, its solemn toll echoing through the room. Nicholas stared at the flames, the doubt still gnawing at him. In the flickering light, his shadow looked larger than life, but his heart felt small and uncertain. The night Nicholas chose to reveal his supposed ruin to Mary arrived with a bitter chill. Snow cascaded gently from the sky, blanketing Hollyridge in an untouched whiteness that glistened under the street lamps. The world outside seemed calm, serene even, but inside Nicholas's heart, a storm raged. He paced back and forth in his living room, his boots scuffing against the wooden floor as he rehearsed his lines for the 100th time. Mary, he muttered under his breath, there's something I need to tell you. Something difficult. He shook his head, dissatisfied with the delivery. No, too formal. Maybe. Mary, I've lost everything. No, too abrupt. Jingle, his loyal Bernese mountain dog, watched him from the corner of the room, his head tilted quizzically. You think I'm making a mistake, don't you? Nicholas asked, sighing as he crouched to scratch Jingle behind the ears. The dog wagged his tail in response, his warm eyes filled with a loyalty Nicholas wished he could count on from Mary. A knock at the door startled him out of his thoughts. Straightening his sweater and running a hand through his snowy beard, he took a deep breath and opened the door to find Mary standing there, her cheeks flushed from the cold. She smiled brightly, holding a pie dish wrapped in a red checkered cloth. Apple pie, she announced, stepping inside. I thought we could share it after dinner. I know it's your favorite. Nicholas forced a smile as he closed the door behind her. You didn't have to go to the trouble, Mary. Nonsense, she replied, setting the pie on the kitchen counter. You've been so busy lately, and I thought a little comfort food would be nice. Are you all right? You seem distracted. Her observant nature had always been one of the things Nicholas admired about her, but tonight, it only made his task harder. I'm fine, he said, though the quaver in his voice betrayed him. As they sat down to dinner, Mary's pot roast and Nicholas's signature mulled cider. He could barely touch his plate. The weight of what he was about to do loomed over him, souring every bite. Mary noticed but said nothing, her own fork moving methodically as she watched him from across the table. Finally, when the plates were cleared and the fire crackled softly in the hearth, Nicholas knew he could delay no longer. He gestured for Mary to join him by the fire, and she obliged, curling up on the couch beside him. "Nicholas," she said, concern evident in her tone. "What's going on? You've been acting strange all night. Is something wrong?" He stared at the flames, the flickering light dancing in his eyes. "Mary," he began, his voice low, "there's something I need to tell you. It's about my finances." Mary sat up straighter, her expression shifting to one of quiet attentiveness. "Your finances? What do you mean?" He hesitated, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure she could hear it. "I've lost everything," he said finally. "The investments I've relied on for years, they've failed. My savings are gone. My properties had to be sold to cover debts. All I have left is my work as Santa, and even that doesn't pay much." The silence that followed was deafening. Mary didn't respond immediately, her gaze fixed on him as if searching for something in his expression. Nicholas could feel his palms growing damp, the tension in the room unbearable. He had imagined this moment so many times, but nothing could have prepared him for the reality of it. "Lost everything," Mary repeated at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," he said, his throat dry. "I'm so sorry, Mary. I wanted to give you a stable future, but I can't anymore." Her eyes narrowed slightly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For a moment, Nicholas thought he saw a flicker of sympathy in her expression, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "So, you're saying that the life we planned together, it's gone?" Nicholas nodded, his heart aching at the way her tone had shifted, more calculating, less tender. "I understand if this changes things for you," he said, his voice trembling. "I wouldn't blame you if you decided to leave." Mary didn't reply immediately. Instead, she rose from the couch, her movements slow and deliberate. She stood by the window, looking out at the falling snow, her back to him. When she finally spoke, her words were cold and precise. "I didn't sign up for this, Nicholas." Her statement hit him like a physical blow. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "You promised me a life of stability, of comfort. If that's gone, then I don't know what we have left. I'm sorry, but I can't do this." Nicholas felt the floor drop out from under him. He stood, reaching for her, but she stepped back, shaking her head. "Mary, please. I love you. We can figure this out together." But her eyes were resolute, her decision final. "I can't, Nicholas. It's better if we end this now." And just like that, she walked to the door, opened it, and stepped out into the snowy night, leaving Nicholas standing frozen in place, his heart shattered into pieces. As the door closed behind her, the only sound left in the room was the faint crackling of the fire, a cruel reminder of the warmth that had just vanished from his life. The moment the door closed, Nicholas felt the stillness of the room swallow him whole. The absence of Mary's presence was like a void, expanding and filling every corner of the house. He stood there, unmoving, staring at the door as if willing her to come back. The bitter chill from the winter air crept in through the small gaps around the frame, but it was nothing compared to the cold now lodged deep in his chest. His legs finally gave way, and he collapsed onto the couch, his head falling into his hands. Jingle padded over, resting his heavy head on Nicholas's knee, but even the dog's comforting presence couldn't break through the despair enveloping him. The fire crackled softly, casting shadows that flickered on the walls, but Nicholas saw only the image of Mary's retreating figure. Her words echoed his mind, each one a dagger twisting deeper. "I didn't sign up for this. I can't do this. It's better if we end this now." He had braced himself for disappointment, prepared for the possibility that Mary's love might not withstand this test. But hearing the rejection come from her lips, seeing the cold detachment in her eyes, it was worse than he had ever imagined. He had hoped for hesitation, for tears, for even the faintest flicker of a fight. But instead, she had walked away without looking back. Nicholas exhaled shakily, running a hand through his hair. "She didn't love me," he whispered, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. "This is what I needed to know." He repeated it as if saying it enough times would make it easier to believe, but the pain in his chest only deepened. The sound of heavy footsteps broke the silence, and Nicholas looked up to see Eli standing in the doorway. He had come by earlier to return a set of ledgers and must have lingered outside, sensing something was wrong. Eli didn't speak immediately. He took in the scene, the slumped shoulders, the red-rimmed eyes, the untouched pie on the counter, and his expression softened. "Nick," Eli began gently, shutting the door behind him and shrugging off his coat. "What happened?" Nicholas shook his head, his voice barely audible. "She left." Eli's brows furrowed as he moved closer. "What do you mean, she left? She didn't even stay to talk it through?" "No," Nicholas said, his voice breaking. "She said she couldn't do it. That without the life I promised her, there's nothing left for us." Eli let out a low whistle, sinking into the armchair across from Nicholas. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his face grim. "I warned you, Nick. I told you this kind of test could backfire. You wanted the truth, but sometimes the truth hurts more than a lie ever could." Nicholas looked up at him, his eyes filled with anguish. "What was I supposed to do, Eli? Pretend everything was fine and risk finding out years from now that she only loved me for my money? At least now I know. At least now I can move on. Can you?" Eli asked pointedly, "Because it doesn't look like you're moving anywhere except deeper into misery." Nicholas didn't respond, his gaze dropping to the floor. He hated how much the emptiness hurt, hated the way the silence of the house pressed in on him like a suffocating weight. He had spent years fostering resilience, building a life centered on giving to others, but in this moment, he felt utterly hollow. Eli sighed, rubbing his temples. "Look, Nick, you did what you thought was right. You had to know if her love was real, and now you've got your answer. But that doesn't mean it's going to be easy. Sometimes the truth isn't the end. It's just the start of a different kind of pain." Nicholas leaned back, staring up at the ceiling. "I wanted her to fight for us," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wanted her to say it didn't matter, that we'd find a way through it together. But she didn't even try." Eli nodded slowly. "Maybe she wasn't the one, Nick. Or maybe the shock was just too much for her to handle in the moment. People don't always react the way we want them to under pressure. Either way, it's done now." Nicholas closed his eyes. The image of Mary's face burned into his memory. For the first time in years, the warmth of Christmas felt far away, like something he could no longer touch. The fire crackled behind him, but it brought no comfort. Instead, its light only served to illuminate the emptiness of the room. The night Mary left felt endless. Nicholas remained seated by the fireplace long after the flames had dwindled to embers, staring into the darkened hearth as if answers might emerge from the ashes. The house, once filled with warmth and laughter, now felt cavernous, its silence broken only by the occasional pop of the dying fire. Jingle whined softly, nuzzling Nicholas's hand. The dog had been his constant companion for years, but tonight even Jingle's comforting presence felt insufficient. Nicholas patted his furry head absent-mindedly, his mind replaying every moment of the evening. Each time he reached the part where Mary walked out, his chest tightened, the pain sharp and unrelenting. He finally rose, the weight of his grief making his movements sluggish. Wandering aimlessly, he found himself in the kitchen, where the untouched apple pie still sat on the counter. It was meant to be a gesture of love, a reminder of the simple, thoughtful moments that defined their relationship. Now, it felt like a cruel remnant of what had been lost. Unable to bear the sight of it, Nicholas placed the pie in the fridge and returned to the living room. He sank into his armchair, his thoughts racing. She didn't love me, he said aloud, testing the words. They hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. Not the way I thought she did. But even as he spoke, doubts crept in. Was he being fair to Mary? Had his test been too harsh, too sudden? Maybe Eli was right. Perhaps Mary's reaction had been more about fear and shock than a lack of love. Nicholas shook his head, frustrated. He had asked for the truth, and Mary had given it to him. Yet instead of clarity, all he felt was pain. The following morning brought no solace. The snowstorm had subsided, leaving Holly Ridge wrapped in a pristine blanket of white. The town looked picture-perfect, like something out of a Christmas card. But to Nicholas, it felt empty. Eli stopped by just after breakfast, his sharp eyes scanning Nicholas's haggard appearance. "You look like you didn't sleep a wink," he observed, pulling off his gloves and taking a seat. "I didn't," Nicholas admitted. He poured 2 cups of coffee, handing one to Eli before settling into the chair across from him. "I kept going over it in my head, wondering if I made a mistake." Eli sipped his coffee, his expression unreadable. "You think you pushed her too hard?" Nicholas shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe this is who she really is, and I just didn't want to see it." Eli leaned forward, setting his cup down on the table. "Nick, I've known you for decades. You're a good man, but sometimes you expect the world to live up to your ideals. People are messy. They don't always rise to the occasion the way you think they should. So, what are you saying?" Nicholas asked, his tone weary. "I'm saying maybe Mary's reaction wasn't about not loving you. Maybe it was about fear. Losing the future you promised her. It probably felt like losing the ground under her feet. And when people are scared, they don't always act their best." Nicholas frowned, considering Eli's words. "So, you think I should forgive her? Pretend last night didn't happen?" "I didn't say that," Eli replied quickly. "What I'm saying is, don't rush to judgment. Take some time to think things through. Let the dust settle." Nicholas sighed, rubbing his temples. "I don't even know if I want to hear from her again. The way she looked at me, the way she just left. It's hard to come back from that." Eli nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Fair enough. But if she does reach out, at least hear her out. You owe yourself that much." As the day wore on, Nicholas tried to immerse himself in his usual routines. He bundled up and ventured into town, delivering gifts to the children who eagerly awaited their yearly visit from Santa. Their excitement and laughter warmed him, but it couldn't touch the ache in his heart. Everywhere he went, he saw reminders of Mary, her favorite coffee shop, the bookstore where they'd spent rainy afternoons, the park bench where he'd proposed to her under a canopy of twinkling lights. By the time evening fell, Nicholas was exhausted, but his mind was no quieter. As he settled into bed, Jingle curled up at his feet. He stared at the ceiling, replaying Eli's words. Was Mary's departure truly the end, or had it been a moment of weakness, a crack in her otherwise loving heart? The answer remained elusive, and Nicholas drifted into a restless sleep, haunted by the memory of her leaving. 3 days passed, each one dragging slower than the last. Nicholas moved through his routines like a ghost, his once jovial spirit replaced by a quiet sadness. The house felt impossibly still, the cheerful decorations mocking him with their brightness. Even Jingle, usually a bundle of energy, seemed to sense his master's gloom, lying silently at his feet wherever he went. On the morning of the 4th day, Nicholas found himself in the workshop behind his cottage, repairing a wooden sleigh destined for one of the town's children. The rhythmic motion of sanding the wood was usually calming, but today it did little to soothe his frayed nerves. His mind wandered, drifting back to the last time he and Mary had been here together. She had stood at his side, teasing him about his meticulous attention to detail while painting the sleigh a vibrant red. The memory was interrupted by the sound of the mail slot creaking open. Moments later, Jingle barked, his tail wagging as he padded toward the front door. Nicholas wiped his hands on a rag and followed, not expecting much, perhaps another holiday card or a catalog. When he reached the door, a single envelope lay on the floor, its white surface marred by the faint smudges of delivery. His heart stopped as he saw the familiar, delicate handwriting. Mary Langley. Nicholas stood frozen for a moment, the letter heavy in his hands. He debated whether to open it all. Part of him wanted to toss it in the fire, to avoid reopening the wound that had barely begun to scab over. But another part, the one still holding on to the faintest glimmer of hope, urged him to read. He walked to the couch, sat down, and carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, neatly folded. Taking a deep breath, he began to read. Dear Nicholas, I don't know where to begin, so I'll start with the hardest part. I'm sorry. I've spent the past few days replaying our conversation over and over again, and I can't stop thinking about the look in your eyes when I said I couldn't stay. I hate that I hurt you. I hate that I walked away. But I need you to understand that it wasn't because I don't love you. When you told me about losing everything, it felt like the ground beneath me was crumbling. I panicked. I thought about the life we'd planned, the home we wanted to build together, the family we dreamed of, and felt like all of it was slipping through my fingers. I didn't know how to process it, so I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. But now, with the benefit of time and quiet, I see how much I've let fear control me. I let my insecurities and my doubts drown out the most important truth. I love you, Nicholas. I always have. And I know now that I should have stayed, no matter how uncertain the future seemed. I don't know if you can forgive me for the way I reacted, but I hope you can try to understand. I needed to write this letter because I owe you honesty, even if it comes too late. I don't expect you to trust me right away, and I don't expect us to go back to where we were overnight. But if there's still a chance, any chance at all, I want to take it. If you'd like to talk, I'll be at the park bench where we first met tomorrow evening at 7. If you don't come, I'll understand. With all my heart. Mary. Nicholas set the letter down, his hands trembling. His emotions churned, relief, anger, sorrow, and a tentative thread of hope all intertwined. He wanted to believe her words, to take comfort in the vulnerability she had shown. But the memory of her walking away, of her cold and detached tone, was hard to reconcile with the love she professed now. Jingle nudged his leg, breaking Nicholas's trance. What do I do, boy? Nicholas murmured, scratching the dog's ears. She says she loves me, but how can I trust her after what happened? The dog's wagging tail and hopeful eyes offered no answers, leaving Nicholas alone with his thoughts. He stared at the letter again, reading and rereading Mary's words until the daylight outside began to fade. Finally, he folded the letter and tucked it into his pocket. I'll sleep on it, he told himself. But even as he said the words, he knew the decision would haunt him until the following evening. The night before Nicholas was meant to meet Mary passed in a haze of restless thoughts. The letter had rekindled emotions he wasn't prepared to confront, love and longing tangled with bitterness and mistrust. His home, usually a sanctuary of warmth and joy, felt more like a cage as he paced its confines, seeking answers that wouldn't come. By dawn, he decided he needed space, a break from the suffocating weight of his thoughts. Donning his heavy coat and scarf, he set out into the fresh morning snow. Jingle trotted beside him, his massive paws crunching through the icy crust as they made their way toward the woods on the outskirts of town. The forest was serene, the tall evergreens draped in white, their branches sagging under the weight of the snow. Nicholas had always found peace here, away from the bustling town and the responsibilities that came with his role as Holly Ridge's beloved Santa. Today, though, the stillness only mirrored the storm inside him. He paused by a frozen creek, leaning against an old birch tree as his breath puffed into the air. Jingle sniffed around the base of a nearby stump, oblivious to his master's inner turmoil. Nicholas watched the dog for a moment before speaking aloud, as if to the trees themselves. Did I push her away unfairly? He asked, his voice echoing faintly in the quiet. Or did she show me who she really is? He closed his eyes, the memories flooding back unbidden. Mary's laughter as they built a snowman in his yard last winter. The way she'd fuss over his beard, calling it the softest cloud she'd ever touched. The quiet moments by the fire when words weren't necessary, their love palpable in the shared silence. And then, the memory of her turning away, her voice, sharp and cold, cutting through his hopes like a blade. I didn't sign up for this. Nicholas opened his eyes, the ache in his chest growing heavier. He felt caught between two conflicting truths. On one hand, Mary's letter had been raw and heartfelt, an admission of fear and regret that seemed genuine. On the other, her initial reaction had been a stark contrast, a choice to leave when he needed her most. He crouched by the creek, picking up a small rock and skipping it across the frozen surface. It clattered against the ice before spinning to a stop, the sound unnervingly loud in the quiet. Jingle came to sit beside him, leaning his large body against Nicholas's leg. "What if Eli's right?" Nicholas murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears. "What if fear made her act that way, and I'm punishing her for being human?" But another voice in his mind countered. "And what if this is a pattern? What if, when things get hard again, she walks away?" He sighed, rising to his feet. He needed clarity, and he wasn't going to find it here. He made his way back toward town, his boots crunching through the snow. The walk home was quiet, the forest fading into the edges of Holly Ridge as he approached Main Street. The familiar sights of the town greeted him, the cheerful wreaths on every lamppost, the warm glow of the bakery's windows where families gathered for cocoa and pastries. Normally, the festive atmosphere would lift his spirits, but today it felt distant, like a play he was watching from behind a curtain. As he passed the park, his eyes lingered on the bench where Mary had said she'd be waiting. It was empty now, dusted with snow, but Nicholas could picture her there. He wondered if she was as nervous as he was, if she had spent the past days wrestling with her own guilt and uncertainty. When he arrived home, the sun was already beginning to set, casting long shadows across the yard. He sat by the fire, staring at the flames as Jingle curled up beside him. The hours ticked by slowly, each minute bringing him closer to the meeting. Nicholas reached into his pocket and pulled out Mary's letter once more. He read it for what felt like the 100th time, his eyes lingering on her final plea. "If there's still a chance, any chance at all, I want to take it." He folded the letter carefully, his heart heavy with indecision. The question that haunted him remained unanswered. Could he risk trusting her again? The next evening, as the clock ticked closer to 7, Nicholas bundled himself in his heavy coat and scarf, his heart pounding with uncertainty. The letter sat folded in his pocket, its presence a reminder of the choice he had yet to make. Jingle whined softly as Nicholas tied his boots, the dog sensing the weight of the moment. "Stay here, boy," Nicholas said, giving Jingle a pat on the head. The dog huffed but settled by the fire, his large eyes watching Nicholas as he stepped out into the snowy night. The air was crisp, each breath forming soft clouds that dissipated quickly. The town was alive with the quiet buzz of Christmas cheer, families heading home with wrapped presents, children giggling as they dragged sleds behind them. The sight should have warmed Nicholas's heart, but his thoughts were fixed on what lay ahead. He approached the park slowly, the snow crunching under his boots. The bench where he and Mary had shared so many moments together came into view, a familiar spot that now felt charged with tension. From a distance, he could see her sitting there, bundled in a long coat and woolen hat. She seemed smaller somehow, her usual confidence replaced with a posture that suggested hesitation. Nicholas was about to call out to her when a voice behind him stopped him in his tracks. Well, if it isn't St. Nick himself. Nicholas turned, startled, to see a familiar figure emerging from the shadows. Ben Thatcher, an old friend and occasional confidant, stood there with a knowing grin. Ben was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a gruff voice and a kind heart that belied his rugged appearance. He wore a heavy leather jacket and boots dusted with snow. "Ben," Nicholas said, surprised. "What are you doing out here?" "I could ask you the same thing," Ben replied, shoving his hands into his pockets. His grin faded as he studied Nicholas's face. "You look like a man with a lot on his mind." Nicholas sighed, his shoulders slumping. You could say that. He glanced toward the bench where Mary waited. It's complicated. Ben followed his gaze, his brow furrowing. That Mary. Nicholas nodded. Ben let out a low whistle. Didn't expect to see her back after what I heard. Nicholas raised an eyebrow. What you heard? Ben hesitated, as if weighing whether to say more. Finally, he spoke. I was at the diner a few days ago. Saw Mary there. She was with someone, tall guy, fancy coat. Looked like he walked straight out of Wall Street. They were sitting close, talking quietly. She didn't seem upset, if you know what I mean. The words hit Nicholas like a punch to the gut. Are you sure it was her? He asked, his voice tight. Ben nodded. Positive. I didn't want to say anything, but seeing you here. He trailed off, giving Nicholas a sympathetic look. Nicholas felt his stomach twist. The image of Mary with another man, laughing and talking while he'd been agonizing over her letter, filled his mind. He turned back toward the bench, his resolve faltering. I don't know if I can do this, he muttered. Ben placed a hand on Nicholas's shoulder. Look, Nick, I've been through my share of heartbreak, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Love's a gamble. Sometimes you win, and sometimes, well, you know, but you won't get answers standing here, in the snow. Go talk to her. If she's not the person you thought she was, better to know now than keep wondering. Nicholas nodded slowly, though his heart still felt heavy. Thanks, Ben, he said quietly. Anytime, Ben replied, giving him a firm pat on the back before walking off into the night. Nicholas stood there for a moment longer, staring at Mary's figure on the bench. The warmth of Ben's words competed with the chill of his revelation, leaving Nicholas unsure of what he would say, or if he could trust anything she had to offer. Finally, with a deep breath, he began walking toward her, each step feeling heavier than the last. As Nicholas approached the bench, his heart pounded harder with every step. Mary sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her breath visible in the cold night air. She didn't notice him at first, her gaze fixed on the snow-covered path ahead, lost in thought. When he was only a few feet away, she looked up, startled. Nicholas, she said, her voice soft. She stood, her eyes scanning his face as if searching for a clue about how this encounter would unfold. Mary, Nicholas replied evenly, stopping a short distance away. He kept his hands in his pockets, feeling the crumpled edges of her letter beneath his fingers. She hesitated, then gestured to the bench. Would you like to sit? Nicholas nodded, and they both lowered themselves onto the cold wooden slats. The silence between them was thick, punctuated only by the muffled sounds of laughter from a family skating on the frozen pond nearby. Mary broke the silence first. I wasn't sure if you'd come, she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. I almost didn't, Nicholas said, the honesty of his words surprising even himself. Her shoulders slumped, and she turned her face toward the snowy trees. I understand. After the way I acted, I wouldn't blame you if you never wanted to see me again. Nicholas sighed, his breath a visible cloud. Mary, your letter. It made me think. A lot. I know you were scared, but walking away the way you did, it felt like more than fear. It felt like you didn't trust me enough to face it together. Mary nodded, her eyes glistening. I know, and you're right. I panicked, Nicholas. When you told me everything was gone, all I could see was the struggle my parents went through when I was a kid. The arguments, the stress, the hopelessness. I didn't want that for us. I didn't want to end up like them. And instead of staying to figure it out, I ran. I was selfish, and I'm so sorry. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, Nicholas wanted to believe her. But Ben's voice lingered in his mind, his description of Mary with another man replaying like a haunting refrain. He turned to her, his expression cautious. Mary, he began, his tone steady but firm. Were you at the diner a few days ago? She blinked, startled by the question. The diner? Yes, I went there for coffee. Were you alone? Mary hesitated, and that brief pause sent a jolt through Nicholas's chest. No, she said finally. I met someone there. Nicholas's jaw tightened. Who? Mary looked down at her hands, wringing them nervously. An old friend, she said, her voice barely audible. An old friend, Nicholas repeated, his voice laced with skepticism. A tall man, expensive coat. Sound familiar? Mary's head snapped up, her eyes wide. How do you know that? I have my ways, Nicholas said curtly. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. Mary, if you want me to believe anything you're saying right now, you need to be honest with me. Who is he? She swallowed hard, her face pale. His name is Daniel. He's an ex. Nicholas felt the words like a slap. An ex? He echoed. And what exactly were you doing with him? Mary shook her head quickly, her voice rising with urgency. It wasn't what you think. He reached out to me a few weeks ago, just to catch up. When things fell apart between us, She stopped, catching herself. I didn't know who else to talk to. Nicholas stood abruptly, unable to sit any longer. He paced a few steps away, running a hand through his hair. So, when you left me, you ran straight to him? No, Mary cried, standing as well. It wasn't like that. I didn't go to him for comfort. I just needed to clear my head, and he happened to call, Nicholas repeated, his tone dripping with disbelief. Do you have any idea how that sounds, Mary? You walked out on me, and within days, you're having coffee with your ex. Tears streamed down Mary's face now, her voice trembling. I didn't plan for it to happen that way. I didn't even know if you'd ever want to speak to me again. Nicholas, please. I'm here now because I realized I made a mistake. I love you, and I want to make this right. Nicholas turned to face her, his heart a mix of anger, sorrow, and confusion. I don't know if I can trust you, he said quietly. How do I know you won't run again the next time things get hard? How do I know Daniel won't be the person you turn to when I'm not enough? Mary's voice broke as she stepped closer, reaching for his hand. Because I'm standing here, telling you the truth. Because I love you, Nicholas, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to prove it to you. Nicholas looked down at her hand on his emotions warring inside him. The warmth of her touch felt familiar, comforting even, but the cracks in his trust ran deep. Proving it won't be easy, he said finally, pulling his hand away. And I don't know if I'm ready to try. Mary's face crumpled, but she nodded, her tears falling freely. I understand, she whispered, but I won't give up. I'll wait as long as it takes. Nicholas turned away, his heart heavy, as he walked back toward the path, leaving Mary standing alone in the snow. The days after the encounter at the park passed in a blur for Nicholas. He threw himself into his work, delivering gifts and spreading holiday cheer across Holly Ridge, but his heart wasn't in it. The joy he brought to others felt like a hollow echo of his own emptiness. At night, he would sit by the fire, Jingle resting at his feet, staring at Mary's letter on the table. He wanted to believe her words, to accept that her love was real. But trust, once cracked, didn't heal easily. And the knowledge of her meeting with Daniel lingered in his mind like a splinter he couldn't dislodge. It was late one evening, just days before Christmas, when the knock came at his door. Nicholas had been half asleep in his armchair, the soft glow of the fire casting flickering shadows across the room. Jingle perked up immediately, letting out a low bark before trotting to the door. Nicholas frowned, glancing at the clock. It was nearly midnight, hardly the hour for visitors. Rising slowly, he crossed the room and opened the door to find Mary standing there, her cheeks flushed from the cold, her eyes red and puffy. Mary, he said, his voice heavy with surprise and weariness. I know it's late, she said quickly, her breath visible in the freezing air, but I couldn't wait any longer. Please, can I come in? He hesitated for a moment before stepping aside. All right, come in. She entered, brushing snow from her coat as she stood awkwardly in the living room. The warmth of the fire illuminated her face, and Nicholas couldn't help but notice how vulnerable she looked. I wasn't expecting to see you again so soon, he said, closing the door behind her. I know, she replied softly, turning to face him. But I couldn't leave things the way they were. I've been doing a lot of thinking, Nicholas, and I realized there are things I need to say, things I didn't say at the park. He nodded, gesturing toward the couch. All right, I'm listening. Mary sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She seemed to gather her thoughts for a moment before speaking. When I left you that night, I made the worst mistake of my life, she began, her voice trembling. I was scared, and I let that fear control me. But it wasn't just fear of losing the future we planned. It was fear of losing you. The idea of seeing you struggle, of seeing you hurt, and feeling powerless to fix it, it terrified me. And instead of staying to face that fear, I ran. Nicholas leaned against the arm of the chair, his arms crossed. And Daniel, he asked pointedly. Mary winced, but she didn't look away. I know how it must have seemed, meeting him after everything that happened. But it wasn't what you think. He called me out of the blue. I hadn't spoken to him in years. And yes, I agreed to meet him, but it wasn't because I was looking for comfort. I needed someone to talk to, someone who didn't know you, who wouldn't judge me for what I'd done. And what did you tell him? Nicholas pressed, his voice calm but firm. Everything, she admitted. I told him about you, about what happened, about how much I hated myself for leaving. He listened, and that's all. When I left the diner, I told him I wouldn't see him again. Because the only person I want to talk to, the only person I want in my life, is you. Her words hung in the air, and Nicholas felt their weight settle on his heart. He wanted to believe her, wanted to feel the hope she was offering. But the hurt she had caused wasn't so easily forgotten. Mary, he said after a long silence, I appreciate your honesty. But honesty doesn't undo what happened. You left when things got hard. You turned to someone else when I needed you most. How do I know that won't happen again? Tears welled in her eyes, and she stood, taking a hesitant step toward him. Because I've learned, Nicholas. I've learned how much I hurt you, how much I hurt myself by not staying. I've spent every day since that night regretting what I did, and I promise you, I will never make that mistake again. If you'll give me one more chance, I'll spend the rest of my life proving to you that I mean it. Nicholas looked at her, his heart warring with his mind. The pain of her betrayal was still fresh, but so was the love he felt for her, the love that had drawn him to her in the first place. I don't know if it's that simple, he said quietly. I know it's not, she replied. But I'm willing to try, Nicholas. I'm willing to work for it, to rebuild what I broke. Please, tell me that means something to you. Her voice broke on the last word, and Nicholas felt his resolve wavering. He sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. It means something, he admitted finally. But rebuilding trust takes time, Mary. And if I'm going to do this, I need to know you're in it for the long haul. No more running. No more half-truths. If we're going to try again, it has to be different. She nodded quickly, hope flickering in her tear-filled eyes. I promise. No more running. Nicholas gave her a long, searching look before finally nodding. All right, let's see if we can make this work. Relief flooded Mary's face, and she stepped closer, wrapping her arms around him. For the first time in weeks, Nicholas felt a glimmer of warmth return to his heart, though the road ahead still felt uncertain. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the sunlight bouncing off the fresh snow that blanketed Holly Ridge. Nicholas rose early, his mind heavy with thoughts of Mary's tearful plea the night before. He had agreed to give her another chance, but the scars of her betrayal still lingered, raw and unhealed. He spent the morning in his workshop, repairing toys for the children of the town, the rhythmic motions of sanding and painting providing a temporary reprieve from his swirling emotions. But as the hours passed, a sense of unease grew within him. If they were truly going to rebuild their relationship, he couldn't let the secret he'd kept weigh on him any longer. By midday, Nicholas made up his mind. Mary needed to know the truth about the test he had devised. If they were going to move forward, it had to be on a foundation of complete honesty. When Mary arrived that afternoon, she looked more composed than she had the night before, though her eyes still held traces of worry. She stepped inside, removing her coat and hat, and gave him a tentative smile. "Thank you for letting me come back," she said softly. Nicholas nodded, gesturing for her to sit. "Mary, there's something I need to tell you," he said, his tone serious. Her smile faltered, and she sat down slowly, her hands resting in her lap. "All right, I'm listening." Nicholas took a deep breath, his gaze steady. "Why, I told you that night about losing everything. It wasn't true." Mary's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" "I didn't lose my wealth or my properties," he said. "I still have everything. The financial ruin I described to you was a test. I needed to know if you loved me for who I am, not for what I have. So, I made up the story to see how you would react." The silence that followed was deafening. Mary stared at him, her expression a mix of shock, hurt, and disbelief. "You lied to me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Nicholas nodded, guilt weighing heavily in his chest. "I did, and I know it was wrong. I know it wasn't fair to you, but I couldn't shake the doubt, Mary. I've seen too many relationships crumble under pressure, and I needed to know that what we have is real." Her face crumpled, and she looked away, her hands gripping the edge of the couch. I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You didn't trust me enough to believe in my love. So you lied to me? Do you have any idea how that feels?" Nicholas moved closer, his voice pleading. "I wasn't trying to hurt you. I was trying to protect myself from building a life on something that might not have been real. And when you walked out, it felt like my worst fear had come true." Mary shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You think that justifies what you did? You put me in an impossible situation, Nicholas. You manipulated me to prove a point." Her words cut deep, but Nicholas didn't flinch. He knew she was right. "I know I broke your trust," he said quietly, "and I'm not proud of what I did, but I need you to understand why I felt I had to do it." Mary stood abruptly, pacing the room as she wiped at her tears. "This isn't just about me walking away, is it? This is about your fear, your inability to trust anyone completely. You tested me because you were too afraid to believe in us." Nicholas watched her, his heart heavy. "Maybe you're right," he admitted. "Maybe I let my fear cloud my judgment. But that doesn't change the fact that you left, Mary, that you didn't fight for us when things seemed hard." She stopped pacing, turning to face him. "Because I didn't know it was a test. I thought everything was falling apart, and I was scared out of my mind. You didn't give me the chance to process what you told me. You threw me into a nightmare and expected me to react perfectly. That's not fair, Nicholas." Her words struck a chord, and Nicholas felt his defenses crumble. She was right. It hadn't been fair. He had set her up to fail, and when she did, he had used it to confirm his fears. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice raw with emotion. "I was wrong to do what I did, and if you can't forgive me, I'll understand." Mary stood there, staring at him for what felt like an eternity. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but steady. "I do love you, Nicholas. That hasn't changed, but love isn't enough without trust. And right now, I don't know if I can trust you." Her words cut deeper than any rejection, and Nicholas felt his heart break anew. He nodded slowly, his head bowed. "I understand," he said quietly. "I won't ask for anything more than you're willing to give." Mary took a deep breath, her tears beginning to dry. "If we're going to move forward, it has to be on equal ground. No more lies, no more tests, just honesty." Nicholas looked up at her, hope flickering in his eyes. "I can promise that." She nodded, though her expression remained guarded. "Then we take this one step at a time. No promises, Nicholas. Just time." It wasn't the resolution he hoped for, but it was something. And as Mary left that evening, Nicholas felt a small spark of hope kindling within him. It would be a long road, but for the first time, he believed it was a road worth walking. The days leading up to Christmas were unlike any Nicholas had experienced. In the past, the season had always been a time of boundless joy, of laughter and togetherness. But this year, it was marked by uncertainty. Each day felt like a step on a tightrope, a delicate balancing act as he and Mary navigated the fragile truce they'd established. Mary visited occasionally, their conversations guarded but honest. They avoided grand declarations or promises, focusing instead on small gestures, shared coffee by the fire, quiet walks in the snow, and tentative smiles that hinted at a shared hope. It wasn't the passionate love they had known before, but it was real, and perhaps that was what mattered most. On Christmas Eve, the town of Hollyridge held its annual tree lighting ceremony. Families gathered in the square, their voices ringing out in carols as the massive spruce tree in the center sparkled with ornaments and tinsel. Nicholas had attended the event every year, playing the role of Santa Claus with joy and pride. But this year, as he donned the red suit and adjusted his hat, his heart felt heavier. Mary had promised to meet him there, and as he stepped into the square, he scanned the crowd for her familiar face. The children swarmed around him, their excitement palpable as they tugged on his coat and rattled off their Christmas wishes. He smiled and laughed, but his mind remained elsewhere. Finally, he spotted her, standing near the tree's base. She wore a deep green coat that brought out the color in her eyes, her face soft with the faintest trace of a smile. For a moment, Nicholas hesitated, but then, with a deep breath, he walked toward her. "Mary," he said, his voice warm despite his nervousness. She turned to him, her smile widening. "Santa Claus," she teased gently, her eyes sparkling in the glow of the tree lights. They stood there in comfortable silence for a moment, the sound of carols and laughter filling the air. Finally, Mary spoke. "This town loves you, you know," she said, her tone thoughtful. "The way the children light up when they see you, the way the parents thank you for all you do. It's incredible. You're incredible." Nicholas chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I just try to spread a little joy. That's what Christmas is about." Mary turned to face him fully, her expression serious now. "And what about your joy, Nicholas? What about what makes you happy?" Her words caught him off guard, and for a moment, he didn't know how to respond. "I thought I had that with you," he said finally, his voice quiet. Mary's eyes softened. "Maybe you still can," she said, "but it's not something you can test or measure, Nicholas. Love doesn't work that way. It's something you feel, something you nurture. And yes, sometimes it's scary, because it means being vulnerable, but it's also worth it." Nicholas looked at her, his heart swelling with a mix of hope and regret. "I know I made mistakes," he said, "big ones, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this work, Mary. No more tests, no more doubts, just us." Her smile returned, small but genuine. "That's all I've ever wanted," she said softly. As the countdown to the tree lighting began, the crowd joined in, their voices ringing out in unison. Nicholas and Mary stood together, their hands brushing but not quite touching. When the tree burst into light, the crowd cheered, the sound echoing through the square like a celebration of hope and renewal. Nicholas turned to Mary, his voice steady. "This Christmas, I don't want gifts or decorations or even this tree. I just want a chance to start over. With you?" Tears filled her eyes, but her smile never wavered. "Then that's what we'll do," she said, one step at a time. As the snow began to fall, they stood together, the distance between them shrinking with each passing moment. For the first time in weeks, Nicholas felt the true warmth of Christmas return. It wasn't the lights or the carols or the gifts that brought it. It was love, fragile but real, growing stronger with every shared moment. This Christmas, Nicholas learned the greatest lesson of all. Love isn't proven through tests or trials. It's built on trust, nurtured with honesty, and strengthened by forgiveness. And as he walked hand in hand with Mary through the softly falling snow, he knew they were finally on the path to something real and lasting.